And can you guys see the screen? Can you guys hear me? And can you guys see the screen? We'll get started. Okay, a second. Hmm. Okay, so today we start with live session 10, where we'll be discussing lectures 28 to 30. Here are some important links, and this is the module we'll be discussing. So it's called Ecology of Change, and we'll talk about, not in that particular order, but we'll talk about impacts of climate change, plastics, and how they affect biodiversity. And uh, we'll also look at some disturbances such as oil spills. In the next module, we'll talk more about applied ecology. So week 10, Ecology of Change. So the first lecture was on oil spills. So first, uh, this graph basically shows us what happens to the community in case of a large disturbance, right? Large but infrequent disturbance. So, for example, in the first case one here, we see that the community was initially in a normal state. So some of these fluctuations will occur even if the community is in the normal state. So for example, if we are plotting, uh, let's say a number of different species, number of individuals of different species and some metric of that, then that would also keep fluctuating, but around some given value. So that given value is the normal value. And of course, there will be some fluctuations. Then this triangle here basically represents a large infrequent disturbance. Right. This is denoted by the triangle. So what happens when we have a large infrequent disturbance in a community that is in the normal state? We see that there's suddenly a change in the community and it goes from the normal towards the altered state quite very quickly. Then we see that slowly the community is starting to recover and the community state is coming back to the normal. After a few years, a few amount of time, we see that the community has come back to its original normal value, somewhere close to its original normal value. And this time, when the community bounces back to the original value versus the from the time of the large and frequent disturbance is called the recovery time. So what can be an example of this? So an example of this will be, let's say you have a forest like this. Initially there are trees and grasses everywhere. And what happens is there's a forest fire and everything apart from this region. So this whole large region which is shaded in burned down and everything that was there burned down. So what happens? Your community went from the normal state, which was it was occupying this much area and had some characteristics, to a smaller state, which is now this because of the large infrequent disturbance, which was fire. But what happens after the large infrequent disturbance? So after the fire is gone, there's still space here for the forest to grow. Then because like many seeds and other spores might be present in this forest. So they like in this patch, which is currently barren because of forest fire, but it might harbor a lot of spores and seeds. So those will also give rise to new plants, new uh, trees and saplings. So slowly we'll see that this area starts to increase. And again, the forest gets re-established after some time. So that's the time between this event and the time till restoration is the recovery period. Right. So that's the first case. So when we have a normal community and there's only one large infrequent disturbance. But what happens if we have multiple such disturbances? So in the second graph, we can see that the community state is initially in the normal. And what happens is first we have a large infrequent disturbance here. So the community goes to an altered state. Then slowly as the community is trying to recover, but it has not recovered fully yet. What happens? We have another large infrequent disturbance. And probably because of that, the community enters into an altered state and is not able to bounce back. So how this might happen? So for example, let's say again in this case, after the forest fire, let's say all of the plants here are dead, all of the plants and other grasses and shrubs are all dead, but there are still plants, trees, and all that are present in this region, right? Now, let's say what happens is when like the forest is trying to expand, when like the roots, empty tree stumps, or like let's say seeds and spores are trying to germinate or grow here, what happens is let's say this area suffers another calamity, which is a flood. So now whatever was left of even after the fire is now gone. And so the forest here has no regenerative power anymore, or like mechanisms, has lost a lot of mechanisms by which it can bounce back. And because of that, it will remain in that altered state forever or for a very long time. Right. Now, the third example is when the community is initially in a, so this was the second one. This is the third one. So the third example is when the community was initially in a somewhat disturbed state, and then there's a large and frequent disturbance. So what happens is the community enters into altered state and then doesn't bounce back. So there are different kinds of disturbed states. So one example would be how climate change is altering. So how climate change is altering the normal community state to a disturbed community state, or how the presence of plastics and all are changing the community to a disturbed state. Like, yeah, basically reducing the community state from below normal towards altered. Okay. So large and frequent disturbances, as I was mentioning, can be like any of these. So fire or a large storm, or tsunami, or like a oil spill, climatic extremes such as like uh, too much heat, too much cold in a given region, abnormally high temperatures or abnormally low temperatures, and heavy pollution, etc. So a disturbed community is generally what we say is a community which is either, let's say, diseased or like infected by some like weed or infested by some weed or something, so that like the community is not functioning at its maximum. Then let's say the community is also facing competition from livestock. So basically, for example, like the example that we talked about long back about uh, basically a grassland where basically we have a prime habitat here, but a somewhat subprime habitat here with a lot of rocks, no water body, but here there's a water body and all. So initially black bugs were present in this area, but after in coming in of livestock, black bugs moved to this area, which is a subprime habitat. Right. So the community that they form here will be subprime because they are more in number and they are feeding on very less amount of grasses and like things that are present there. So the community here will be more disturbed, more degraded than the original community. Right. Then the other example, the other thing that makes a community disturbed is presence of pollutants, maybe air pollutant, water pollutant, and so on. And the last point is when the community is facing climatic changes. Right. So in this lecture, we talk mostly about oil spills. So what are oil spills? An oil spill is the release of a liquid petroleum hydrocarbon into the environment. So based on the location where it happens, it can either be terrestrial. So for example, like oil lakes that were formed during Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and otherwise it can be marine. So for example, oil spill when the deep water horizon oil rig exploded, right? Accidentally exploded. So here is what a oil lake looks on land. So basically you have a lot of land, trees, vegetation, but there's a lot of oil that is spilled all over here. And this is what oil spill looks like in water. So there are three kinds of oil spills that are classified. So the first is a natural oil spill, which is basically seepage of oil from uh, below the surface of the earth. So, for example, here in Gulf of Mexico, we see that sometimes we see these streaks of oil that are present in the surface of the water. So that basically comes from the bottom of the land. So there's some oil that is naturally leaking from oil reserves on the land. Okay. The second one is accidental. So, for example, a Deepwater Horizon incident, which happened in 2010, where basically uh, the oil rig, which was used to basically extract oil from the earth, exploded, and this led to a leak of a large quantity of oil into the region. And the third type is intentional. So, for example, the Gulf for oil spill, where basically um, Iran spilled oil to prevent US ships from arriving on nearby in that area and stuff. To prevent basically enemy ships from navigating in the sea properly. So as we said, oils are basically hydrocarbons. So what are hydrocarbons? So a hydrocarbon is an organic compound that consists entirely of hydrogen and carbon, and these form a major chunk of petroleum oil. So here we have some examples of hydrocarbons which are found in petroleum oil. Then how do we classify hydrocarbons? So based on their specific gravity, they're divided into two groups. Group one, which has very low specific gravity, such as kerosene. So these group one hydrocarbons basically float on water because their specific gravity is less than one. And group five is a group which has very high specific gravity. So generally greater than equal to one. Should be greater than equal to one. So here the example is bitumen, which would like sink in water. So this classification based on specific gravity is useful when we are discussing the persistence and the fate of oil spills, especially in marine environments. Okay. Uh, Hydrocarbons can also be classified based on their origins. So petrogenic hydrocarbons are hydrocarbons that are derived directly from mineral oils. Pyrogenic hydrocarbons are hydrocarbons that are derived from incomplete burning of mineral oil. So if you burn mineral oil, but there's still some amount of residue that is left, that will mostly consist of pyrogenic hydrocarbons. And biogenic hydrocarbons are derived from biological processes that act on mineral oils, such as microbes that are acting on these oils. Right. So what happens to a oil spill in the marine ecosystem? Okay. Does anyone have any questions or doubts till now? Okay, so let's say here we have a water body, and the black part here basically on top of this. So this black thing is basically a oil spill. So what are things happen to an oil spill? So due to wind, due to uh, wind and movement of the waves and all, movement of the surface of the ocean. So basically what happens is these oil spill will spread to different regions, right? It might also come up to the beach and cause issues there, lead to cause a lot of death of organisms on the shores and basically coastal and shoreline animals and birds. The other thing is what happens is due to the action of sun. So basically something, so the first thing is there's some evaporation. So due to normal heating because of the sun, some hydrocarbons that are present in this oil will basically evaporate into the air. And the other thing is due to photolysis. So photo is sun and lysis. Photo is light and sun lysis is basically breakdown. So basically some of these hydrocarbons that are present in the oil spill will break down into smaller hydrocarbons or into other different forms due to photolysis. Some of these things will get dissolved into basically the water, and some others will basically become emulsified. So emulsified is basically, so if you, let's say, take a glass of water and you put some oil on top of it, and then you like stir it or shake it vigorously, you see that like small droplets of uh, oil are forming, right? So first of all, this small droplet formation is needed. And then if you put a bit of soap in that, you see that soap kind of makes these droplets of oil go inside the water so that it's no longer on the surface, but it's present in the water as small droplets. So that's basically emulsification. So basically small droplets of these oil get dissolved, not get dissolved exactly, but get emulsified into the water. And this dispersion can basically move inside the water, sometimes going down and leading to sedimentation. So if there's some heavy hydrocarbon here, group 5 hydrocarbon, which has a high specific gravity, that will basically go down. It will go get sedimented on the bottom of the ocean and basically be um, taken up by uh, organisms, benthic organisms, which are basically feeding on the bottom of the sea um, or the bottom of the ocean. Then what happens is these birds, so before the birds, so first, uh, a lot of these oil and all will end up in biological systems because of ingestion. So basically, uh, these fishes eating these uh, other phytoplankton that are basically taking up this oil, or maybe fishes eating other smaller fishes that have eaten this oil by chance and things like that. So it gets accumulated in the trophic chain also, accumulated and magnified. And what happens is when birds come and eat the fishes, they basically also ingest these hydrocarbons and whatever like maybe toxic particles that may be present in these oil spills also. And the other thing is when birds also get, uh, so when birds or other animals go near this oil spill, they also get coated in that oil. So that also affects their movement and their ability to feed and do other, carry out other stuff if there's a lot of coating on them. Okay. So what are the impacts of oil spills on the ecosystem? So the first thing is, as I was saying before, upon coating. So if animal is coated by the oil that is present in oil spill. So it can either like experience physical smothering, where basically the ability of that animal to move or feed or like swim and fly and all uh, is reduced. And the other thing is for birds and all, especially, it leads to loss of thermoregulation because uh, now, like, so birds' feathers generally store air to create a layer of insulation. But if the feathers are basically oiled, they are not able to store air. So the birds are then affected by the high or low temperatures based on the height at which they are flying and the place in which they are and things like that. Right. The second thing that happens upon coating is that some volatile hydrocarbons might be present in that oil, which might be present on your skin or body, which you might inhale. So these animals might inhale by chance. And the third thing is basically absorption through skin or mucosa. So both of these options lead to toxicity in, in animals. Uh, and Yeah, the other way in which oil can have impact on the ecosystem is through dissolved products. So basically, if oil dissolved in water is absorbed through the skin or ingested by different animals while eating food and things like that, that also leads to toxicity. There are various factors that influence the impact that oil spills have on organisms. So, for example, the seasonality. So if the organism is in like mm, breeding season, so there are more juveniles or more eggs that are present near the in the area and not a lot of adults. So basically uh, this leads to a higher mortality or a higher impact on the organisms because basically juveniles are not might not be better equipped to handle these sudden drastic changes, right? Or these being coated by oil and things like that. It may negatively affect both juveniles and eggs. So it can prevent eggs from breathing or exchanging air with the atmosphere, right? And the other thing is, if the species that is affected is a keystone species, then that will also have a very huge impact on the whole ecosystem. So, for example, if the oil spill happens somewhere near mangrove forest, it will lead to a lot of destruction because a keystone species like mangrove will be affected by this, right? Because like mangroves have pneumatophores on their root, which basically get blocked due to oil, and they are not able to breathe. The other factors that influence the impact will be lifestyle factors. So we talked about K-selected and R-selected animals. So K-selected animals are animals that have a long lifespan and low rates of reproduction. So these animals will be more impacted because uh, it's very difficult for case-selected organisms to replace population that is rapidly lost, whereas our selected populations can deal with such um, rapid loss of population because of uh, high number of births and frequent reproductive seasons. Okay. And the other factor is health and condition. So if animals are diseased or if they are migrating from a different area and they're not probably well adapted to the area in which they're living in currently, they might be more affected by these external uh, disturbances like oil spills. So next we'll discuss some few terms that are also generally associated with impacts of uh, large large disturbances in oil spills. So the first thing is vulnerability. So vulnerability describes the likelihood that a resource will be exposed to oil. So what is the probability that something will get exposed to oil? So if there's an oil spill, the vulnerability of the surface is high, but the vulnerability of the uh, ocean bed is very low because the, what do you say, uh, oil generally floats on top of water and does not sink to the ocean floor. Unless there's a leak coming from near the ocean floor, it's very difficult for oil to be present there. Right. The second term is sensitivity. So sensitivity assumes that the resource, that after the resource is, assumes that the resource is exposed to the oil and describes the relative effect of that exposure. Right. So it basically describes what effect the exposure would have. So, for example, a deep water coral may be sensitive, but not vulnerable to a surface oil spill. So, if there's a oil spill on the surface, it might, so the coral that is living deep in the water might be sensitive to oil. So, if there's a little bit of oil, it will get a lot hampered. But it's not vulnerable to a surface oil spill because there's no way for that surface oil to come down to the coral. While a rocky shore seaweed may be vulnerable but not sensitive. So a rocky shore seaweed lives near the shore. So it's more vulnerable to a surface oil spill, but it is not sensitive because it has a mucus layer that protects it from oil. Right. Uh, So some other terms that are associated with impacts are toxicity. So the toxicity is the potential or capacity of a material to have adverse effects on living organisms. Acute toxicity basically means that harmful effects in an organism through a single or a short-term exposure. So short-term exposure and quickly you develop symptoms, or single exposure and you see symptoms. So that is called acute toxicity. Chronic toxicity is basically the ability of a substance or a mixture of substances to have harmful effects over an extended period, usually upon repeated or continuous exposure, sometimes lasting for the entire life of the exposed organism. So, toxicity is basically the potential of a material to have adverse effect on a living organism. So how does something bad negatively or badly affect an organism? Acute toxicity is basically when it's in the short term or when it is done due to short-term exposure or single exposure. So for example, if you, let's say, mm, drink cyanide, then you'll of course die. So that's acute toxicity because like a single dose or short-term exposure can lead to death. Whereas chronic toxicity happens over a much more extended period of time and usually involves repeated or continuous exposure. So, for example, pollutants that might be present in the air might be causing a lot of diseases, respiratory diseases. But these diseases don't develop in a day or two, but due to continuous exposure to the same pollutant over and over again, these diseases slowly evolve. What are some other terms? So another term is exposure, which is basically the combination of duration of exposure to the chemical and concentration of the chemical. So basically, it determines how much someone has been exposed to a given chemical or a pollutant. Right. Exposure route is basically the way in which our organism is exposed to the substance. It can be ingestion, absorption through gills, or contact with skin, and absorption through skin, and so on. Right. And magnitude. So the magnitude of a toxic effect basically depends on the sensitivity of a organism to chemicals. But it is also a function of both concentration and duration of exposure to the chemical. So magnitude is basically what toxic effect is seen in an organism. So what's the value of that? So the value depends on both the concentration and duration of exposure, but not only on both the concentration and duration of exposure, but it also depends on the sensitivity of the organism. So two organisms which have different sensitivities will have different magnitudes of toxic effect, depend even if given the same concentration and duration of exposure to some chemical, let's say oil. It, now, a lethal effect basically results in the death of an organism. A sublethal effect basically results in reduction of its biological function or health. So, for example, affecting its growth or its ability to reproduce, making it sterile, or like the condition of its skin or anything like that is a sublethal effect. But a lethal effect results in death. So, bioavailability, it is basically the extent through which a chemical is available for uptake into an organism. And with respect to oil spills, it is usually closely related to both display of toxicity and the rate of biodegradation. So what does this mean basically? It means that the mm, bioavailability of oil is basically the extent to which oil is available to an organism for uptake. Okay. So it's related to both the toxicity of the oil and the rate at which it is degrading. So the rate of biodegradation. Bioaccumulation, basically, it occurs when an organism absorbs a toxic substance into its tissue at a rate greater than at which the substance is lost. So basically, you're eating more than you can digest, or basically uh, ingesting more oil than your body can basically digest or break down or remove. Sorry. That is basically leading to accumulation of oil in your body. That is called bioaccumulation. Then biomagnification. So biomagnification is basically the increasing in concentration of a substance, such as a toxic chemical, in the tissues of tolerant organisms at successively higher levels in the food chain. So basically what happens is, let's say there's some oil spill or some other chemical, there's some zooplanktons which are basically ingesting it. So they're ingesting it at a rate higher than at which they can degrade it. So basically they're accumulating a bit of this oil. Then these are eaten by a smaller fish, which basically then take up more of these, what do you say, degrade, undegraded, accumulated basically chemicals or toxins into their body, because less number of fish eat more number of phytoplanktons than uh, photoplanktons. Then basically we have a larger fish which basically eats all of these fishes, and the concentration here increases many. So yeah, that's how biomagnification works. Uh, this is also known as bioamplification or biological magnification. Biomagnification. So an example of this is basically, let's say we are looking at concentration of DDT, which is a uh, pesticide which was used before DDT was involved, invented. So basically, in a clear lake system, even if we have 0.01 ppm or parts per million of DDT in the water, uh, it has been tested and found out that the concentration of DDT in planktons is basically 5 ppm. For fish, it ranges from 40 to 300 ppm. And for piscivorous birds, for birds which are eating fish, it ranges from 1600 to 2500 ppm. So like increases manifold. Then what are the impacts that these oil spills have on different animals? So planktons, they are basically sensitive to exposure. They show both acute, chronic, and sublethal effects, but they recover quickly due to their short generation time. So this is our selected organism, and they basically recover quickly. Then seabed life is basically life that is found on the bed of the sea or the bottom of the sea. So significant concentrations of dissolved or dispersed oil from surface oil spills rarely reach below 10 meters. So there's not a lot of uh, disturbance that they can create. But subsea blowouts, so inside the sea, if there's some leakage or some spilling, it may have a higher potential for impacting the seabed in deep water. And hydrocarbons that are sedimenting, so coming down and settling, may pose risk to bottom dwelling animals. Like in fishes, oil spills have acute, chronic, and sublethal effects. So and also from a fisheries perspective, like tainting or basically, even if these hydrocarbons are present in very low concentrations, they give a foul smell or a taste, which generally people don't like. So that's a major concern in fisheries uh, industry. Uh, for marine mammals, basically they need to surface periodically to get air. So come to the surface, take air, and then go down. So this leads to high exposure to high concentrations of oil because when they're breathing, they're ingesting a lot of oil from the surface of the water, right? So again, like the oil coating their fur leads to insulation and water repellence. Cleaning of the fur by licking and all might lead to ingestion oil, and sometimes the oil might get into their nasal pathways and block their airways. Yeah. Uh, for birds, basically, as we were talking before, oiling of the feathers may cause reduced ability to move, feed, or may lead to hypothermia. So basically, by preventing birds from thermoregulating using their feathers. Ingestion may occur through like preening or consumption of contaminated food. Contaminated food can be fishes with high amounts of oil in them, right? Or other life. And basically, preening is basically when they're licking, not licking themselves, but basically cleaning themselves using their beak, right? Uh, Transfer of oil in eggs and young may reduce survival. So when basically they are getting food and feeding it to the young ones, so that's what generally birds do. They'll catch some food and come back and feed it to the young ones. So this transfer might involve transfer of oil also, which might reduce the survival chances of the young ones. For shoreline and coastal habitats, seaweeds are better protected due to their mucus coating that can resist oil. Mangroves can be killed by oil that covers the pneumatophores, so they can't take up air or breathe anymore. Burrowing crabs may be killed when their burrows are penetrated, right? So they don't have anywhere to go or stay. So how can we reduce the impact of basically these oil spills on the ecosystem? So we can do two things. So first is cleaning. So in the context of an oil spill, cleaning is basically defined as returning the level of petroleum hydrocarbons to a level that has no detectable impact on the function of the ecosystem. So you basically clean out all the oil, remove all the oil. Recovery, on the other hand, is characterized by the re-establishment of a biological community in which the plants and animals characteristic of that community are present and functioning normally. So cleaning is basically just removing all the oil, not carrying up to previous or undetectable layers, right? But recovery is making sure that the ecosystem is coming back to its stable biological state. So some operations to clean up include contain and scoop, where basically they use booms to contain the spill and skimmer ships, which basically go and collect oil from the surface by taking up water, then burn. So basically, this oil spill can be burnt in a controlled manner to mm, basically reduce the amount of oil that is present on the surface of water. Disperse. So basically, uh, we can use chemical dispersants, which break the oil into small droplets that then facilitate natural biodegradation by microbes. Mm, Other things that we can do is let nature act. So when there's a possibility of the oil impacting the ecosystem very little, it can left as such for nature to take care of it and get rid of the oil through natural mechanisms. The other thing is we can use biological agents and fertilizers. So the natural action of microorganisms can be speeded up by adding fertilizers so that they grow more to promote their growth, and then they can act on these oil spills and dispersed oil molecules. Right. So, what are some strategies to protect ecosystems from oil spills? So, the first thing is avoid setting up oil rigs in especially vulnerable spots. So places where it might leak or places where there might be a lot of biodiversity that is getting affected by it. Prevent spills with better technologies. Develop models to anticipate spread. So if we know that an oil spill is going to happen or is has happened somewhere, how fast can we basically predict where all it will go? So that will help us design a zone where we can focus our efforts. Right. Then maintain rapid response teams and technologies so that as soon as something is detected, you go and you basically try to mitigate the impact. Utilize studies on long-term impacts and mitigation options. So basically, long-term impacts and mitigation options like studies should be carried out, and mm, basically more and more options should be developed. That was it for the first part. Does anyone have any questions? We'll pause for 2 minutes here. Okay. So next, in the next lecture, we talked about plastics and biodiversity. So what is a plastic? So a plastic is basically a synthetic material that is made from a wide range of organic polymers such as polyethylene, PVC, nylon, etc. And that can be molded into shape while soft and then set into a rigid or slightly elastic form. So this is like the technical definition of a plastic, but I'm sure everyone has seen plastic. Everyone knows what plastic is and what it looks like. For example, we have here a bunch of plastic caps on the right hand side. So a short history of plastics. In 1600 BC, Mesoamericans were known to process natural rubber into a plastic. Then after that, we come to near 19th century, where basically polystyrene and PVC or polyvinyl chloride were invented. Then in 1909, bakelite was used in commercial products such as crockery, cooking items, right? Then uh, like handles of crockery and things like that. Then in 1926, PVC was commercialized. 1933, saran was invented. In 1937, polyurethane foam was invented. So these are different kinds of plastic. 1938, Teflon was invented. So Teflon gives the non-stick layer on basically the pans that are used for cooking. Right. Nylon and neoprene were invented in 1939. So nylon is basically used to create textile, if I'm correct. Yeah. Then in 1941, polyethylene terephthalate, which is PET or polyester, was invented. So PET is basically the plastic that you generally see in these plastic water bottles and all. So that is PET. During the World War II, which happened after 1941, metals became very scarce. So plastics were widely manufactured to replace metals. Right. In 1951, high density polyethylene Polypropylene were invented. 1954, styrofoam was invented, which is widely used for packaging and basically, yeah, whenever you see any kind of packaging like for fridge, TV, and all, they use the styrofoam and basically. uh, At one point, people used to have styrofoam glasses and stuff, right? uh, in parties and all. Yeah. In 1979, plastic production in the US exceeded the steel production. So we see that overall across the years, the amount of plastic that is produced all across the globe has been increasing, and it has been predicted to increase quite a lot till 2050. More than half of the plastics that were produced ever that have ever been produced have been made after 2000, and plastic production started way early in the 1950s. Okay. So within this like last 20 years, there's been more than half of the plastic has been produced. So the amount of production of plastic is quite high. Right. So where does all this plastic go that is produced? So once we use something, once we basically drink from a bottle of water, what do we do? So a small fraction of it is basically reused or recycled. Mm, Many parts of it are burnt. So, but this burning releases a lot of CO2 and releases dioxins, which are basically toxic compounds. Right. Then a lot of them go into landfills, so basically into holes on the ground. And since they are not easily degradable, they stay like that for a very long time. And soon we are running short of the space. So there are not a lot of places where we can dump plastics anymore. Like, and eventually, whatever plastic is left will go into terrestrial ecosystems and environments, and ultimately will like go into marine ecosystems and marine environment. So what happens to plastics in the marine environment? So 15% of the plastic floats on the surface, 15% goes ashore, and 70% sinks to the ocean bottom. So floating debris can be found anywhere on the ocean. Most beaches you go to, you'll see a lot of plastic bottles, plastic caps, and other things that are floating around. So these affect organisms in a very negative way. Right. Then sometimes you see that they come up and they are washed ashore. So you see a lot of plastic that is deposited on the beaches or along the shoreline of a place due to like coming out from the ocean and getting deposited here. Then what happens is sometimes, sorry, sometimes these plastics are basically used up by other organisms, which should not actually be using them. So, for example, these hermit crabs basically have they don't create their own shell. They use a shell of any other mollusk that they can find generally. But when these large number of basically plastic materials and stuff are basically washed ashore on the beach, they generally tend to use these materials. So, for example, here is a bottle cap, toothpaste cap here, there's a bottle cap here, maybe a light bulb here. So all these things and all these different garbage things are basically used by these organisms, and any organism which basically feeds on the hermit crab will now probably eat the piece of plastic or ingest parts of the plastic, right? Then plastic is also found on the seabed, where basically most of the plastic that is found in the ocean is deposited on the seabed. And yeah, one major culprit of plastic on the seabed is basically nets that have been cut off, so ghost nets and stuff like that. Based on the size of the debris, their plastic debris is classified into three types. Macro debris is basically debris that is greater than 20 millimeters in size. So the main concerns here are ghost nets. So basically fishing nets that have been torn apart or basically cut and basically left out in the ocean or stuck somewhere on the ocean floor and things like that. Meso debris is basically debris that is from 5 to 20 millimeters in size. They are dominated by nodules. So nodules are basically resin granules that are intermediate in plastic production. So basically what happens is when a company that is producing plastic or so plastics are basically polymers of these organic compounds, inorganic compounds. So basically what happens is the factory or the manufacturer which is producing this plastic will produce this in the shape of nodules or like small granules of plastic. Then these granules are basically then uh, transported into a number of different other companies or factories where basically they are heated and casted into different shapes such as let's say a bottle or let's say a pen or whatever. So different companies take up these nodules and basically convert them, give them shape. Right, that's how plastic products are created. So these nodules are basically the main uh, things that compose the meso debris. And the third thing we have is the micro debris, which is less than 5 millimeter in size. So this is formed mostly through fragmentation of micro or meso debris. And it also consists of plastic scrubber particles that might be found in like face wash and other cosmetic products. So like if you have plastic beads in any of them, those things are basically also counted into micro debris. So what happens? How are these smaller fragments formed? So generally, synthetic polymers that contain like stabilizer, fillers, extenders, and other active additives. So they are basically in the presence of sunlight, oxygen, and other microbes. Uh, a lot of processes occur, such as absorption of light, photolytic reactions, which basically lead to breakdown of the polymers, then radical formation and degradation by enzymes produced by microbes and all. So these all lead to oxidation and scission reactions, which basically cause discoloration of the plastic. So let's say you have a plastic which was white or transparent, and after some time you see that if you leave it out in the sun and all, it has changed its color. It has become discolored, little bit orange or things like that. Right. So and it would have also lost a lot of its properties such as mechanical integrity, strength, and other things. Right. Uh, so basically, this leads to production of smaller fragments. Oxidation is basically any reaction that involves the addition of oxygen to something, and scission is basically cutting of molecules into two or into many parts. Right. So yeah. So this is how debris that is decomposing looks like. So for example, here we have a plastic bag from which you can see fibers, a plastic film from which you can see like fibers and stuff that are coming out. Then you have like many different small particles that might be formed. So for example, this line might be formed out of a, let's say a plastic or a nylon rope and all by cutting down from it. Right. Mm. Then there are these smaller fragments, these small films, pellets, and foams that might be formed by breakage of different kinds of plastic, right, or decomposition of different kinds of plastic. Then what happens is these smaller particles can also aggregate to form larger particles. So, for example, uh, this eco-colony is basically when small pieces, microplastics, basically accumulate on surface of microbes or other organisms, or microplastics basically aggregate or come together, right, on other similar, let's say, hydrophobic surfaces and stuff like that. So that basically forms an aggregation. The other thing is when a lot of microplastics are ingested by organisms and they produce feces. So their feces contain a lot of these microplastics. So that also leads to aggregation. Then what we have is something called marine snow. So here what happens is generally when you have microplastics that are present on the top of the ocean. So let's say this is the ocean bed. Right? So there are a lot of microplastics that are present in this region on the surface. So once they aggregate due to different things, what will happen is they'll grow in size and they'll slowly fall down. Right. So this particles that fall down inside the water is basically known as marine snow because it's snowing. So these aggregations of smaller particles also result in marine snow. So does anyone have any questions or doubts? Feel free to unmute or write in the chat or anything if you have any questions or doubts. Okay. So how does this impact wildlife? How does basically this plastic debris impact wildlife that is present in the marine system, for example? So the first thing it leads to ingestion. So basically death of organisms due to ingestion. So for example, this is a photo of an albatross, juvenile albatross, which was probably fed a lot of plastics by its parents. And after it has died, we see that its body has decomposed, whereas the plastics that it ate has still not decomposed. Right. So these plastics may go inside the body, get stuck in some places like your esophagus and all, and basically lead to death. So as was the case of this albatross. And then microplastics are also found in like all kinds of organisms. So for example, here we see that in zooplankton, so these whitish areas are basically plastics. So this one, this one, this one, and this. So basically these zooplanktons have are also ingesting a lot of plastics, and that is in turn affecting them. And basically their fecal pellets also have a lot of plastic material that is present. Yeah. So these things also influence the basically plastics also influence the bottom dwellers and filter feeders. So basically what happens is these filter feeders generally take a lot of water and then filter out the water and keep only the organisms or planktons that might be present in that water for the digestion. So what happens is if there's a lot of microplastics present or plastics that are present, that will also be ingested by them and that will negatively affect their health. Right. These plastics might also come and basically for organisms that are burrowing or present inside the seabed. Basically, these microplastics can cover the openings of their burrows that might lead to their death or inability to come out. Right. And basically, for some other organisms, it can also lead to them getting buried because of a lot of plastics that is getting deposited over them or around them. Right. The second thing that can happen is entanglement, which might even lead to smothering. So, for example, animals such as turtles and seals get entangled into nets. So, generally, this is the problem with ghost nets and all. So, that are present in the ocean but not actively used. So, these generally come entangle animals in them and they're unable to get out or move. And basically, if there's a predator around or if they are not able to move and find food, they eventually die. Then persistent bioaccumulative toxic substances. and accumulation and concentration of hydrophobic toxins. So we'll discuss these two things. So the first thing is basically plastics have a lot of toxic substances that are bioaccumulative. So basically, they stay in the body, and this bioaccumulative thing leads to biomagnification and leads to higher levels of toxins in other organisms, right? So, for example, this compound called bisphenol A is something which is a plasticizer. So it basically gives the plastic the property of being, what do you say, uh, resilient to like pressure or something. Right. So if you press a bottle of water, it comes back to its normal shape. So that is due to this plasticizer, which gives it some amount of elasticity. However, this compound is also an endocrine disruptor. So it basically mimics the sex hormones and sorry, in different organisms and can lead to a lot of changes manifesting in the organism when ingested. Right. So these are toxic. This is one of the toxic substances that is present in plastic. It is also known as BPA, bisphenol A. The other thing is basically, so because these plastics are generally used everywhere, we want them to be flame retardant. So we don't want them to catch on fire. So there's a lot of these flame retardant substances or brominated compounds that are used as flame retardants. So these also act as toxins for organisms, and higher levels of or higher accumulation of these toxins lead to death. So the next point is accumulation and concentration of hydrophobic toxins. So it's a similar point, not the same, but what happens is basically since a plastic is a hydrophobic piece, so it's basically hydrophobic or it does not like water, right? So toxins that might be hydrophobic might get dissolved or might get stuck into uh, the surface of plastics, especially microplastics, might be coated in like hydrophobic toxins because they are more attracted to them than to the water that is present around them. And therefore, this might lead to an increased concentration of hydrophobic toxins in the microplastics, which when ingested will lead to high toxicity and other lethal, sublethal effects. Right. Then the next thing is the potential to alter habitats and behavior. So as we saw before, due to presence or availability of a lot of plastic in and around, it has altered the behavior of animals. So for example, these hermit crabs take up any plastic shell. Then there are seahorses which basically tie themselves to um, Q-tips or earbuds, right, that are thrown into the ocean. So these alterations in habitat and behavior is one way in which plastics are affecting or impacting wildlife. The last point is basically dispersal, including the transport of invasive species. So what does this mean basically? So let's say we have a mainland here and we have a small island here. So generally for organisms to go from here to here, they would need some kind of raft. Right. And generally, the kinds of raft that would be available to smaller organisms would be things like, let's say, a coconut that is floating in the water. So let's say there's a coconut tree here, right? And basically, because of that, coconut falls into the water, the small organism climbs onto the coconut and basically goes with the coconut to this island. However, a coconut is a biodegradable substance. So it cannot travel very long. After a point, the coconut will get degraded. It will get maybe dissolve, not dissolve, but like it will get degraded. It won't have its structural integrity and all in the water. So let's say it can reach this island, which is island one, but it cannot reach another place, which is basically island two. So this coconut cannot travel there. However, now due to presence of um, basically these plastics, what happens is these plastics are not biodegradable, therefore they will keep floating in the water. If they're floating in the water, they'll be there in the water till someone takes them out, right? Or till they go to a shore or something like that. So what happens is now these organisms can use these plastic bottles or other plastics to basically move between from this mainland to this island, right? So this basically increases the risk of invasives being transported into different areas because if this organism earlier was only found in the mainland and island one due to this limited dispersal ability here, and the island two has been structured in a way so that this organism is basically invasive here. It will compete with the species of organisms that are found here. So what will happen is after the introduction of plastics, or if there's a lot of plastic around for the organism to go from the mainland to island 2, it will go there and it will basically invade that area. Right. So this is also another impact that plastics have on wildlife. And even like people have shown that even microplastics can influence the complete hierarchy of biological organization. So uh, we see that like as you go down the hierarchy, you go to lower levels. Sorry, you go to more finer levels such as cellular levels, the speed of the response is quite high. However, if you go to the other side, the relevance or the ecological relevance of the response is quite bigger. So generally, like microplastics by ingestion or by uptake across membranes, like absorption and all, and basically by releasing of contaminants, they affect different mm, uh, parts of organism or different organisms. So in subcellular level, what happens is like enzyme activity, gene expression, and all these are altered. And then there's some oxidative damage inside the cell, subcellular organelles. Then on a cellular level, it might lead to apoptosis, which is basically programmed cell death. Mm. It might also alter membrane stability and phagocytic response of cells. Right. Then, as we move forward to organs, there might be histopathology issues. So, histopathology is basically relating to the tissue. The issues that come up in the tissues, then there might be a high metabolic demand on the energy reserves because now maybe so let's say an organism ingests a lot of plastic and it gets stuck in its stomach. So now it cannot process food optimally. So it needs more food to process and get the same amount of energy as before. Right. So the metabolic demand it puts is higher. Then at the level of individual, it can lead to mortality, it can lead to decrease in growth and things like that, which will eventually in the population level lead to low fecundity, low offspring viability, and imperfect larval development or issues during larval development. And on ecosystem level, it will basically affect ecosystem functions and lead to community shifts. So even microplastics that might be ingested and acting on lower levels of biological organization might manifest in in higher levels of biological organization. So how can we help? What can we do? So the first thing is the three R's, which is reduce, reuse, and recycle. So reduce buying plastic, reuse as much as possible. If you have a bottle, get a good bottle and use it again and again. Don't buy multiple bottles and throw them around. Recycle, even if you have to throw around plastic, make sure you recycle it and you do not burn it or dump it somewhere. Right. The next thing is lifestyle changes. So basically, by using alternatives of generally plastic materials such as metal straws or glasses instead of straws and all that, we can make lifestyle changes and reduce the amount of plastics that we are using. Another third thing how we can help is basically by using alternative materials, which are basically bioplastics. Right. So bioplastics are basically plastics that are made from like biodegradable substances. So basically, plastics are polymers. So bioplastics are basically polymers of carbohydrate and all. So that can be basically decomposed much easily by organisms and all. So it does not have a lot of negative effect on the environment. Does anyone have any questions till now? Okay, so that was it for the second lecture. In the third lecture, I talked about impacts of climate change. If no one has any doubt, we'll move forward. So now we revisit the thing again. Basically, the first thing is when we have a normal community, and basically there's one large infrequent disturbance. In the second one, we have a normal community, and we have multiple infrequent disturbances. Right, this is like multiple disturbances. And in the third one, we have a altered or disturbed. Actually, it is disturbed, not altered. Altered is the final form. So disturbed community, and there's one large infrequent disturbance, and then the community doesn't come back. So climate change is basically one of the things that makes our ecosystem or environment disturbed in place of normal. Right. So before we learn about climate change, what is climate? So climate is a broad composite of the average conditions of a region, measured in terms of things such as temperature, amount of rainfall, amount of snowfall, snow and ice cover, and winds. So all the climatic variables of a region measured and basically taken an average across a long period of time, for example, 30 years, let's say. So the classical period for taking this average is 30 years. So this is called as the climate. So the climate has a lot of these different components due to which it basically functions. So these components basically manifest to give the climate. For example, the ocean, land, atmosphere, vegetation, and ice cover. So these all different things interact with each other to produce the climate of a given area. So for example, if a land is near ocean, if the area of land is near ocean, it generally has a much more stable climate because uh, what do you say? The rate of heat absorption of land is higher than the rate of heat absorption of ocean. So at one given time, the ocean is cooler than the land during the day. So there's a hot air that is present. So basically, let's say you have land here and you basically have ocean here. Right. So let's say this thing is land and this thing is ocean. So when there's sunlight that is falling during the day, so this land area gets heated up. So the air here rises above. Whereas in the ocean, there's a lot of, it does not get heated up quickly. So the air here is still present below. So there's a high pressure of air in this region and a low pressure of air in this region. So wind flows from here to here via the atmosphere. Right. So that leads to a cold breeze in the land. Right. And again, during the night time, what happens? The ocean is basically hotter because it does not let go of heat easily also, whereas the land is cooler, so there's a breeze from the land to the ocean. So things like this basically manifest as temperature, humidity, um, and rainfall and all. So presence of large water bodies, high amounts of evaporation will lead to a lot amount of rainfall. Presence of high mountains where clouds can uh, basically come and hit basically will cause a lot of rainfall. The vegetation will also affect the humidity or the amount of uh, what do you say water that is transpired into the atmosphere. So basically, things like this will also affect the temperature, wind, humidity, and all. And ice cover basically determines the what do you say amount. It also regulates the amount of vegetation that might be present in a given place, or how cold or hot it might be, and things like that. So these are the different components of the climate system, and they interact to give us the climate. So what is climate change? So climate change basically refers to a statistically significant variation in either the mean state of the climate or its variability persisting for an extended period, typically decades or longer. So basically climate change is the variation in either the mean state of the climate or the variability of the climate. So in general, if we talk about climate, let's say for a given place like Bangalore, let's say the normal climate is, let's say 22 degrees, and it varies from, let's say, uh, 12 degrees to, sorry, let's say 18 degrees to, let's say, 26 degrees, right? So that is the general climate of Bangalore. Now, if you see that either this has changed from 22 to, let's say, 27 degrees Celsius, so it is the mean state of the climate has changed, then you term this as climate change. Otherwise, if you see that the range of variability, so for example, now instead of 18 to 26, it's 18 to 34, right? Now, this change in variability also refers to climate change if these changes are persisting for an extended period, which is typically decades or longer. Okay. So climate change may be due to natural internal processes or external forcings or to persistent and anthropogenic changes in the composition of the atmosphere or in land use. So climate change may be happening due to natural internal processes or due to external forcing such as anthropogenic changes or human impacts. So basically, we have different things such as the ocean, land, atmosphere, so the different components of the climate, vegetation and ice cover. And these interact with each other, all of them, to basically give rise to the climate of a given region. Right. So forcings are basically things that act on this whole climate system to produce a response. So we'll look into forcings and response in a bit. So forcings can be things such as change in plate tectonics. So that would lead to shifting of land masses across the oceans, right? Changes in the Earth's orbit, which would lead to basically changes in season and climate because seasonality and all depends on the tilt of the Earth's axis or the Earth's orbit around the sun. Right, the day of the year, length of the day, and things like that also will change. Then the third thing is changes in sun strength. So if there's any change in the amount of sunlight that the sun is producing, that is also a forcing that will lead to changes in climate, right? Or it will affect the climate system of a given area. And the fourth thing, which we are the most focused on, or which we are most interested to know about, is anthropogenic forcing. So how does anthropogenic changes or anthropogenic forcing change the climate system to produce a response? Now, what can be a response? A response can be a change in atmosphere, change in ocean, change in vegetation, change in land surface, or changes in ice. So responses can also be things like so these are basically the variables in which we can see responses. Responses will be things like drought or flood or basically increased temperature or forest fire, etc. So these things that are unnatural or basically increased frequency of these things will be basically a response. Right, because there's a lot of climate change, there's a lot of increased temperature, so there's a lot of drought because everything is going dry, then there's a friction between two trees, and that leads to a forest fire and things like that. So these are different responses of climate change. Apart from these physical responses, we also have biological responses. So, for example, so these on the left hand side, you see all these components. So, for example, temperature, rainfall, CO2 concentration, ocean dynamics. So, any change in these will manifest as biological responses, ranging from organisms to up till the level of biomes. So, for example, in the level of organisms, we might see due to change in temperature and all that, we might see natural selection in place. So where some species might survive better than others, then we might see high rates of mutation if there's a large, uh, so basically due to increased concentration of CO2, um, a lot of the ozone layer is getting depleted or it's getting disturbed. That leads to a high amount of UV radiation that leads to higher mutation rates in organisms, right? Then these genetic changes might manifest as basically physiology, might also become physiologically relevant, or these changes in climate components might lead to physiological changes also. So, for example, TSD is basically dependent sex determination, which happens in turtles and tortoises. So basically, if the egg is above a certain temperature, it has one sex, let's say female. If it's below a certain temperature, then it is male. That the individual that is born out of it is male. So things like this. Mm, so things like this will be affected if the temperature changes, then disease susceptibility will increase if there are a lot of extreme events such as drought or flood, which is basically putting a lot of stress on the organism, right? There might be changes in the phenology. So for example, uh, let's say it's getting warmer and warmer, so earlier in the day. So that means the organisms which were generally active during, let's say, 10 to 11 a.m. are now active at 8 a.m. because they get the same amount of heat and sunlight at 8 a.m. that they were earlier getting at 10 a.m. So this is basically changes in phenology or the timing of expressing behavior in organisms. That will also lead to uh, or manifest as population dynamics. So where basically we see that, uh, let's say dispersal or changes in phenology and changes in fecundity and all might lead to decrease in increase in infant mortality, changing the age structure, changing the recruitment, which is basically how many more uh, individuals you are basically getting. Recruitment is in a way uh, about the future generation, right? How many individuals you are getting to breed and helping them breed and all that. Then the sex ratio will also get affected. For example, in things like turtles and tortoises. In tortoises, basically turtles. Uh, as I told before, this temperature dependent sex determination will basically lead to changes in sex ratio, abundance of organisms in different areas. Then it will also lead to changes in distribution of organisms. So, for example, let's say some organism was found earlier in this piece of area, but now let's say there's due to some increase in temperature, this area has become hotter. In this area, everything has become hotter. So let's say the gradient was from here to here, it was, let's say, 30 degrees to 26 degrees. But now, after heating up, this has become 34 degrees, this has become 30 degrees. Right. So the organisms that were earlier staying in this area will not be able to survive because it is hotter now. Whereas in the newer areas, they'll try to occupy because the area further down here will have become uh, in the optimum range of that organism, right? So this will lead to distribution changes, uh, yeah, changes in the niche of organisms. Then that will lead to basically these phenological changes, which is basically changes in flowering time, changes in like uh, pollinator like maturation and stuff like that might also lead to dysynchronization. So basically, it might happen that let's say some plant is getting pollinated by a bee. So the plant needs a certain temperature to basically flower, whereas the bee looks at the amount of sunlight to basically go forage. So if the amount of sunlight and the temperature around are basically different due to, let's say, higher amount of carbon dioxide that is present in the atmosphere that is trapping more heat, then what will happen is basically uh, the flower might start flowering earlier compared to when the bee is basically reproducing or coming to look for nectar. So that would lead to desynchronization, where basically both the organisms which had earlier similar times of activity where they basically interacted and basically the bee got food and the flower was pollinated. Now these two activities are basically uncoupling and basically the flower is not getting pollinated anymore and the bee is not finding any food. Right. This will also lead to other effects in the community level, ecosystem level, and biome levels. So we'll take a look at some of these things that are actually happening in the world right now. So, yeah. So, for example, phenological anomalies generally correlate well with temperature anomalies. So, for example, here we are seeing a plot of anomaly in phenology and anomaly in the temperature. So, these two graphs marked as T basically represent the anomalous temperature. And we see that other things such as the spring arrival of birds and the hatching in flycatchers basically follow these patterns of change across years. So when there's an anomalous temperature, there's an anomalous behavior, early and late arrival of birds, and basically early and late hatching in flycatchers. Right. Then these so this is an example of how we are seeing phenological anomalies that are correlating with temperature anomalies, saying to us that these are the effects of climate change. So these phenological shifts are basically effects of climate change that are coming about due to changes or disruptions in the temperature and anomalies in the temperature. Here we see how habitat changes. So basically, what do we say? We see that for a number of different organisms, uh, we see that for phytoplankton, as the temperature increases, the density of phytoplankton decreases. So basically, every organism has their own like optimal temperature at which they function, right? So if the temperature is maintained at the optimal temperature, we see the highest activity. But if you go above or below it, then the activity and the concentration or the abundance of that organism decreases. Similarly, we see that in a given habitat, the total biomass decreases as the temperature increases, indicating that more and more individuals or organisms are basically not able to survive. Right. However, we see that the concentration of zooplanktons increases as temperature increases. So since these zooplanktons feed on phytoplanktons, what will happen is as the phytoplankton number decreases when the temperature increases and the zooplankton number increases, there will be more and more zooplanktons and less food available. So eventually these will also collapse after some time. Right. Then basically we see how the survival percentage and basically duration of larval stage change due to temperature. So these are changes that are happening in a given habitat due to temperature. There are also habitat level destructions that are happening. So for example, in figure A, we can see that in the Great Barrier Reef, uh, the coral reef system is basically declining because of warm sea temperatures. Then we see here that the in the second photo that the kelp forest that is present in like California, Bay of California, basically, due to again ocean warming, basically a lot of these kelps are dying. So it's leading to a loss of habitat for both the fishes that are present here and the stingrays and other fishes that are present in the kelp forest. Right. Then there's a lot of loss of mangroves that is also seen due to increase in water levels. So basically, mangroves have these new metaphors which are coming out of the water to breathe as the water level increases due to um, increase in so basically, due to increase in temperature, it leads to melting of polar ice caps, right? So that melting of polar ice caps does two things. So the first thing is basically it leads to less availability of habitat for this polar bear, right? And it leads to increase in sea levels. So that leads to more and more death of organisms such as mangroves, which basically, yeah, the roots get lost, and basically the land is getting uh, submerging into the getting inundated and all. So that is leading to a lot of death and habitat level destruction, all in different habitats also. Like, another example we see of climate change is that so, for example, here we see that as the frost level is decreasing due to climate change over the years. So initially there was a lot of days of frost or a lot of days of lot of harsh winter, which the native plants had adapted to survive. So there was a less number of invasives that are present in the given area, right? But however, when we see due to climate change, the number of frost days or the winter is getting less and less harsh, right? So that has led to a growth of invasive plants because they can tolerate these temperatures better, and basically uh, these lead to higher growth, and they can outcompete the native plants that are present, and basically leads to increase in the number of invasive and basically um, exotic species. Right. Then we see that there's a lot of uh, proximate and emergent ecological responses. So proximate responses are basically, let's say, physiological, morphological, and behavioral effects. So, for example, organisms that have the generally marine organisms have this life cycle where they have larvae or propagules, and basically they turn into adults, and these adults then give rise to again larvae or propagules and so on, right? So abiotic changes in the environment, mm, such as physiological uh, changes in the environment, so for example the temperature and the pH or the salinity of the water, when it changes, it leads to a lot of physiological, morphological, and behavioral effects, both for the larvae and the adults. Right. Additionally, effects are felt based on the transport processes. So, like the dispersal of the larva or movement of the adult is also affected because they don't want to go into regions that are very hot or maybe very cold for them. Right. Then there are some community level interactions that are also uh, coming in because of changes in the population size due to this warming or heating. So basically, this leads to changes in the interaction strength between these organisms and other organisms that are present. Right. Now, these proximate ecological responses, which are basically direct responses of, in a way, very direct responses of, or close by responses of these warming effects, lead to emergent ecological responses, which is basically these. So once these changes in population size and interaction strength will occur, then we see a lot of distributional shift. We see a lot of changes in productivity. We see changes in diversity and all other stuff. So these all things are also seen in many marine animals, and that is thought to be an ecological response to climate change, and that is said to be an ecological response to climate change. Then, as I was telling before, there might be uh, local extinctions due to climate change. So, for example, earlier we had organisms living in this area, but now as so the part here heated up, the bottom part. So what happens is on the cold front, there's expansion and more areas are occupied, whereas on the warm edge, there's some local extinction that is happening. So this climate change has led to increase in the extinction possibilities. So this is something that we have seen across multiple taxa, across multiple predictions, and yeah, that the temperature rise is also leading to a increase in the percentage of extinction of different taxa. The other thing that we see here is basically the uh, changes in the spatial distribution or basically the range shift. So earlier this organism was present from here to here, but now it is moved up from here to here. Right. This we see an example of this would be changes in distribution of insects on mountains. So we talked about it before. Basically, let's say you have a hill and you have this range, which is basically 30 degrees to 15 degrees, where your particular type of insect can survive. Now, due to climate change, what happens is this part gets heated up from 30 to let's say 35 degrees. This part gets heated up to 20 degrees. And there is some area here which is now 30 degrees and some area here which is now 15 degrees. So what will happen is your organism will now basically come up here instead of that area here. Earlier it was in this area, now it is in this area. So there's a shift. Okay. So this has been seen for multiple insect species, even for disease carrying vectors such as mosquitoes and all, it has been seen. Then the other thing that people have seen is basically changes in allele frequency. So one thing is what people saw in the tawny owl. So basically these owls are present in areas which have a bit of snow. So what happens is there are these trees and there is like snowfall. So most of the times these trees used to be coated in a layer of snow. So in that case, there are two morphs of this owl. One is brown and the other one is gray. So the gray one is better able to camouflage when there's snow. And the brown one is not able to camouflage better when there is snow. But it is better able to camouflage when there is no snow because it mixes with the color of the tree branches. Right. So now what is happening is that due to climate change, these trees are basically not having a lot of snow. They're mostly not covered in snow. So what happens is earlier the proportion of gray owls, gray moths was very high, and the proportion of brown moths was low because of snow deposition. But now what has happened is due to less snow, the gray moths have decreased, whereas the brown moths have increased in number. Okay. So this is similar to the example of the peppered moths that we talked about during and after industrial revolution. Right. So what can we do? Because we are seeing these changes, so we know that climate change is happening and organisms and environments are getting affected. So what can we do? So we can do two things. Either we can do mitigation or we can do adaptation. Mitigation is basically a human intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. And adaptation is basically adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. What do they mean basically? So let's say we have system, now we have increased amounts of CO2, the greenhouse gases. We have higher temperatures, right? We have basically less biodiversity and things like that due to climate change. So, what does mitigation tell you? Uh, Mitigation basically tells you that we need a human intervention to reduce the sources and enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases so that basically we control this amount of CO2, we reduce the temperature eventually, and this will lead to a higher amount of biodiversity because we are decreasing the CO2, bringing it back to normal levels. So the temperature and the biodiversity should go back to normal levels. What adaptation, on the other hand, is saying is that we have increased the CO2, we have increased the temperature to beyond a certain point, after which we cannot get it back to the normal. So what we should instead do is we should try to get adapted to the higher temperature. Okay, so we can modify the natural system or we can modify ourselves so that we can bear the effects of this higher temperature and basically increase carbon dioxide. And so that the biodiversity here also will increase, but it will not go back to normal, but it will increase in another way because it is adapted to a different thing now. Right. So this is the mitigation adaptation flowchart, which basically tells you what we should do and what we should not do. If basically there's a, if we recognize that there's climate change and we see that there's minimal impact, then we don't need any adaptation. We might not even need any mitigation. If there is too much climate change, what might happen is basically mm, we may try to mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions and stuff like that. But if mitigation is not possible, we can try adaptation. If mitigation is not possible, we try to get adaptation. If we have sufficient capacity, adaptive capacity, we can basically do adaptation. If we don't have sufficient adaptive capacity, we can basically build the adaptive capacity and then do adaptation. Uh, right. Whereas if we are able to mitigate, if we try to mitigate, but we are not able to mitigate, we encounter failure, then we see that mitigation is not possible. We again go to adaptation. But if we are able to mitigate and the impact is minimal, then we don't need any adaptation and our climate will go back to normal. Okay. So what are the options for mitigation? So the options are reducing emissions. So putting in laws, policies, adopting green energy initiatives such as solar, geothermal, hydrothermal, and other sources of power instead of coal or fossil fuels. Then the red is basically reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Then the other thing we can do is we can create sinks. So sinks are basically places where greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide and all are absorbed. So things like artificial trees, carbon sequestration in geological sites, planting trees, afforestation, RED plus, which is basically conservation and sustainable management of forests to enhance the forest carbon stock. So these are the different mitigation options. So next we'll talk about adaptation. So what are the kinds of adaptation? We can have anticipatory or proactive adaptation versus reactive adaptation. So proactive adaptation is when we are anticipating that this change will come about. So we are getting adapted to that change before it has come. Reactive is after a change has happened, we are trying to react to it. Adaptation can be autonomous or spontaneous versus planned. So autonomous or spontaneous is basically when people come together and do something or figure out ways to get adapted or basically adapt. Whereas planned is basically going through the government, making an established plan and basically planning it out and carrying out adaptation. It can also be private versus public. Private basically means private done by certain uh, private individuals or organizations, and public is basically done by the general public. Now, we talked about capacity building and adaptive capacity. So what is adaptive capacity? Adaptive capacity is basically the ability of a system to adjust to climate change, including climate variability and extremes, and to moderate potential damages, to take advantage of opportunities, or to cope up with the consequences. So adaptive capacity for a system or a environment or an ecosystem is basically the ability of the system to adjust to that climate variability or extreme that has occurred without suffering a lot of harmful consequences. So here are the different elements of adaptation. So we talked about this before also when we talked about the Deming cycle or the PDCA cycle, where we basically plan, do, check, and act. So the first step is basically assessing what are the climate impacts, what is the vulnerability of different things. Then we make a plan, then we implement our plan and we check. Check is basically where we basically observe all the climatic variables, non-climatic variables, how they are changing. Is it getting better or is it getting worse? Then we decide to act or adjust our policy. So if what we are doing is working out, we'll continue doing that. If it is not working out, we'll try to adjust it in some way or the other. Right. And the cycle continues. So there are three options for adaptation. So the first is create a resistance to change. So this basically we can reduce the effect of fires, insects, diseases. We can provide better protection, removal of invasives, and resistance breeding. So these are basically creating a resistance to change, so that even if there's a uh, change, it does not manifest. Right. Then the second thing is promote resilience to change. So basically here we are saying that even if there's a change and the community state is altered, there should be some resilience so that the community can come back up. Right. So surplus seed and sperm banking, intensive management during establishment, promotion of biodiversity rich ecosystem are some ways to promote resilience. The third thing is enable ecosystem to respond to change, which is basically assisting natural adaptations and transition. So, for example, assisted migration to new areas. So, if something has died off in a given area due to forest fire, some tree, and it's not able to go back to that origin to its original habitat, what we can do is we can assist in migration. We can put plant seeds, or we can basically assist migration of other organisms that it depends on, increasing redundancy, manage for asynchrony. So basically, due to climate change, as we talked before, let's say there's some dyssynchrony between pollinators and flowering period of plants. So what we can do is we can induce flowering in plants, or we can introduce pollinators at the right time so that there's synchrony, and basically over time they again harmonize and basically uh, carry out their functions at the same time. Right. Then we can also establish new native forests, considering past spread, and promote connected landscapes. So these are ways for which we can, in which we can do adaptation so that the ecosystem is able to respond to change. Right. Then there are certain things which are termed as maladaptation. So basically, any changes in natural or human system that inadvertently increase the vulnerability to climatic stimuli, or an adaptation that does not succeed in reducing vulnerability but increases it instead, is termed as a maladaptation. Right. So these are all the things that we talked about. Does anyone have any questions or doubts? We'll just do a short recap. So first we talked about disturbances and their impacts. Large and frequent disturbances, multiple large and frequent disturbances, and disturbances to a disturbed community. And we talked about what are these disturbances, what are disturbed communities. Then we talked about oil spills, what are the types of oil spills, and what are hydrocarbons, what are things that are present in oil spills. Then how do we classify hydrocarbons? what happens to oils in a marine ecosystem, then impact of oil spills on the ecosystem, factors that influence the impacts on organisms. Then we talked about certain terms such as vulnerability, sensitivity, toxicity, exposure, lethal effects, sublethal effects, then bioavailability, bioaccumulation, and biomagnification. We talked about the impacts that oil spills have on different animals such as plankton, seabed life, fish, marine animals, and birds. Uh, we talked about how we can reduce the impacts of oil spills on ecosystem by cleaning or by recovery, and how we can put in strategies to protect ecosystems in future. We talked next about plastics and biodiversity. So what is a plastic? A short history of plastics. What is happening to all the plastics that are produced? Then basically, how do we classify plastics? How are smaller fragments produced? How are aggregates produced? How do they impact wildlife by ingestion, by entanglement, uh, bioaccumulation of toxic substances, accumulation and concentration of hydrophobic toxins, potential to alter habitat and behavior, then dispersal, including transport of invasive species. We talked about how microplastics can influence the complete hierarchical levels of organization and biology, and how we can help and mitigate these, some of these effects. Then we talked about climate change, revising on the disturbances. Then we talked about climate, the climate system and how it works. What is climate change? And what are the different kinds of forcings that act on the climate system? What are the responses that we see from the climate system? Abiotic responses and basically biological responses at different levels. Then we talked about some of these responses, for example, how anomalous phenology correlates with anomalous temperature. We talked about habitat changes, habitat level destructions. Due to climate change, we talked about rise in exotic and invasive species, ecological responses. We talked about local extinctions, changes in spatial distribution, and changes in allele frequency. Then we talked about how we can mitigate and adapt to climate change, and what are the different options for mitigation and for adaptation. And yeah, basically, what is maladaptation? Does anyone have any question regarding anything? If there are no questions, we'll stop here today. We will next stage. We will discuss about applied ecology. Thank you for attending. We'll see you next time.